Some offers should never be spoken aloud, especially not in front of 1,000 armed warriors who could end your life before your next breath. But Donovan Pritchard stood in the center of that Apache encampment, surrounded by more horses and weapons than he could count, and made an offer that turned the desert air to ice. 1,000 horses, his entire fortune, his legacy, his pride, everything he had built across 3 decades of blood and sweat. For one night, with another man's wife at his ranch. The words hung in the air like a noose. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes either mercy or massacre. And what made it worse, what made every warrior grip their weapons tighter, was that Donovan knew exactly whose wife she was. Kahale, the man who had never lost a negotiation, the man who had never forgiven an insult, the man whose eyes now burned with something far more dangerous than rage. 3 days earlier, Donovan had owned the largest horse ranch within 5 territories. He had men who feared him, rivals who envied him, and a reputation that opened doors from the trading posts to the governor's mansion. But none of that mattered anymore. His son was dying. The boy had 14 days at most, according to the doctor who had ridden 200 miles just to deliver that sentence. Some kind of fever that burned from the inside, turning his son's skin gray and his eyes hollow. No medicine touched it. No prayer seemed to reach it. The doctor had seen it once before, in a mining camp near the Badlands, and everyone infected had died screaming. Donovan had spent 2 weeks hunting every healer, every medicine man, every traveling doctor within riding distance. Most took his money and failed. Some took his money and ran. One old trader finally told him the truth over whiskey in a back room that smelled of tobacco and desperation. There was one person who might know how to stop that fever. A woman who had learned healing from the old ways, before the settlements, before the treaties. She lived with the Apache now. She was married to their leader, and her name was Naira. Donovan knew that name. He had tried to forget it for 7 years, but some things carved themselves too deep to erase. Naira had been part of a small Apache band that used to trade peacefully near his ranch. Back when he was younger and hungrier and stupider about what mattered, there had been a dispute over water rights, a confrontation that got loud, threats on both sides. Then someone's rifle went off and suddenly there were bodies in the dirt and smoke in the air, and Donovan's men were burning lodges to cover their tracks. The territorial marshal called it self-defense and closed the investigation within a week. But Donovan remembered the woman who had stared at him through the flames, holding a wounded child, her eyes promising that this debt would come due someday. That woman was Naira, and now she was the only person who could save his son. So Donovan rode into Apache territory alone, unarmed except for a piece of paper that outlined his offer. He had expected to be killed at the border. Instead, warriors escorted him directly to Kahale. The leader sat on his horse like he had been carved from the desert itself, and beside him sat Naira, watching Donovan with recognition and something that looked almost like satisfaction. Behind them, hundreds of horses moved in the wind, and hundreds of warriors waited to see what the white man wanted badly enough to walk into death's mouth to ask for it. Kahale listened to the offer without expression. 1,000 horses for one night with his wife. The words felt like acid in Donovan's mouth, but he said them anyway because his son's fever was burning hotter every hour, and time was something he no longer had. The silence stretched. Warriors shifted. Horses stamped. Naira's face revealed nothing, but her hand rested on her husband's arm like she was holding him back from something inevitable. Kahale finally spoke, his voice carrying across the camp with the weight of someone who had never needed to raise it. You rode here to insult me in front of my people, to offer horses for one night with my wife like she is property to be traded. Donovan's throat was dry as sand, but he forced himself to hold the man's gaze and speak the full truth. I am asking that she come to my ranch for one night, to save my son who is dying from a fever no doctor can cure. I was told only she has the knowledge to stop it. The clarification did nothing to ease the tension. If anything, it made things worse. Kahale's expression darkened. You want my wife to leave our people, to ride alone to your ranch, to enter the home of the man who burned her village, and you believe 1,000 horses makes this acceptable? The words hit like physical blows because they were all true. Behind Kahale, a warrior raised his rifle. Others followed. The moment balanced on a blade's edge, and Naira had still not spoken a single word. Naira dismounted and walked toward Donovan, while every warrior watched. When she stopped 3 feet from him, she spoke in English clearer than most men he knew. You remember my daughter? Donovan's chest tightened. He remembered a child clutching Naira's leg, while flames consumed everything around them. She died 2 days after your men burned our lodges, from the fever that comes when the body breathes too much smoke and the lungs fill with fluid. Naira's voice stayed level, but her eyes were knives. That is the same fever your son has now. The words hit like stones. Cahill spoke before Donovan could respond. So you understand what you are asking. You want the woman whose child you helped kill to save your child. And you believe one night is enough time to do this. Donovan felt the trap closing but had no choice except to walk into it. I was told she has knowledge that can cure him. I am offering everything I own for that chance. Naira stepped closer. You were told correctly. I do have that knowledge, but you understand nothing about how healing works. She gestured to the warriors around them. These men think you came here to buy me for one night like I am a possession. But even if your offer was genuine, even if you truly only want me to cure your son, one night is not enough. The statement hung in the air. Donovan's desperation must have shown on his face because Naira continued without mercy. The medicine requires plants that grow in the high country, a day's ride north. They must be harvested fresh, prepared precisely. One mistake in the gathering or preparation, and the medicine becomes poison. The treatment itself takes 3 days of carefully timed doses. She paused, letting him understand the impossibility. So your offer of 1,000 horses for one night is meaningless. By the time I rode to your ranch, gathered the plants, prepared them, and treated your son properly, at least 7 days would pass. Maybe more. Donovan felt the ground shifting beneath him. 7 days. His son might not have 7 days. And even if the boy survived that long, asking this woman to spend a week at his ranch, surrounded by his men, in the place where he had planned the attack that killed her daughter, was asking for something no amount of horses could purchase. Then teach me. The words came out before he fully thought them through. Teach me to gather the plants, to prepare them, to administer the treatment. I will do it myself. Naira studied him with an expression that might have been surprise or contempt. You think knowledge passed down through generations can be learned in a conversation? That you can simply be told what to do and then do it correctly? She glanced at Kahali, something unspoken passing between them, then looked back at Donovan. If I teach you, it will not be quick. You will need to ride with me to the high country. Spend days learning to identify the right plants and reject the poisonous ones. Learn how to harvest them without destroying their medicine. Learn preparation methods where the smallest error kills instead of cures. And you will be alone with me at my mercy, trusting that I do not simply lead you into the wilderness and leave you to die. The alternative she presented was somehow more terrifying than the original offer. At least if she came to his ranch, he would be on familiar ground surrounded by his men. But riding north with her, alone, into territory he did not know, completely dependent on someone whose child he had helped kill, that was asking him to place his life in her hands while his son died slowly back home. Cahale's eyes glittered with cold satisfaction. So, you offer 1,000 horses for one night with my wife at your ranch. But what you actually need is something far more difficult. You need her to agree to teach you. You need me to allow my wife to ride into the wilderness alone with the man who destroyed her family. You need 7 days where you are helpless and she holds all the power. And you need to trust that when you return, the knowledge you gained will be enough to save your son before he dies. The sun beat down. Everything in Donovan screamed that this was impossible, that the risk was too great, that he should find another way. But there was no other way. His son was dying, and this woman held the only knowledge that could save him. I accept, he said, and the words felt like stepping off a cliff. Whatever it takes. 7 days. Alone. At her mercy. I accept. Cahill looked at his wife. She nodded once, sharp and final. He turned back to Donovan with eyes that could freeze fire. Tomorrow morning. Bring the horses to prove your offer is real. Then you ride north with my wife. Alone. If you harm her, your son dies and you die screaming. If you fail to learn what she teaches, your son dies. If you try to run, we will find you. The only way your son lives is if you submit completely to someone you once tried to destroy. The warriors lowered their rifles. Not in welcome. In the understanding that death was coming one way or another. Donovan rode back to his ranch through darkness that felt heavier than any he had known. The conversation with his foreman went exactly as expected. You want to give away every horse we own to the Apache? For what? Marcus had worked the ranch for 15 years and his face showed every year of that loyalty. For my son's life. Donovan answered. Marcus looked at him like he had gone mad. The boy is dying either way. The doctor said so. You give away those horses and we got nothing left. No breeding stock, no trade goods, no way to recover. The other men gathered in the bunkhouse nodded agreement. They had families too. Jobs that depended on the ranch surviving. Donovan wanted to scream that they did not understand. That his son was 14 years old and burning from the inside, and that no amount of horses mattered if the boy was dead. But he also knew Marcus was right about the mathematics of it. 1,000 horses represented everything. The ranch would be gutted. Half the men would need to find work elsewhere. The ones who stayed would spend years rebuilding what Donovan was about to trade away. I'm not asking permission, Donovan said quietly. I'm telling you what I'm doing. Any man who wants to leave after the horses are gone, I'll write you a reference and won't hold it against you. The room stayed silent. Men shifted. Someone spat tobacco juice into a tin can. Finally, Marcus nodded once, sharp and angry, but nodded. We'll help you round them up, but don't expect us to pretend this makes sense. By dawn, 1,000 horses stood in a massive herd that took 6 men to control. Donovan's son lay in his bed upstairs, fever-bright and hardly conscious, while his mother sat beside him with a wet cloth and prayers that were starting to sound like goodbyes. Donovan knelt beside the bed and touched his son's forehead. The heat was like touching a stove. I'm going to fix this, he said. His son's eyes opened briefly, unfocused and glassy. Don't leave me. The words were barely a whisper. Donovan's throat closed around the promise he wanted to make but could not guarantee. Instead, he said, I'm bringing back medicine, real medicine. You hold on until I get back. He did not mention where he was going or who he was riding with. His wife would never allow it if she knew. The ride to the Apache camp took 3 hours because the herd moved slowly. When Donovan arrived, Cahal was waiting with 30 warriors and an expression that gave away nothing. They spent 2 hours counting horses, verifying brands, making sure Donovan had not tried to cheat by including old or sick animals. When they finished, Cahal spoke in Apache to his men, and they began sorting the herd with an efficiency that spoke of lifetimes around horses. Naira appeared on a gray mare, carrying supplies in leather bags that looked worn from years of use. She wore traveling clothes and her hair was braided tight. When she rode past Kahali, she touched his hand briefly, and Donovan saw something pass between them that made his chest ache. Trust. Partnership. The kind of thing he and his wife used to have before grief started building walls between them. We ride now, Naira said without looking at Donovan. The plants are fresh only certain days. We already lost time because you needed to gather your horses. She kicked her mare forward without waiting. Donovan followed. Behind him, he heard Kahali's voice giving orders in Apache. He did not need a translation to understand the message. If Donovan did not return his wife safely, there would be a reckoning that made the 1,000 horses look like mercy. They rode north into high country where the air thinned and the landscape turned rocky. Naira stayed 50 feet ahead, never slowing to let him catch up, never looking back to see if he followed. After 6 hours, when the sun was directly overhead and heat shimmered off the stones, she finally stopped beside a narrow creek. Donovan dismounted, legs aching and mouth dry as sand. Naira did not offer water or conversation. Instead, she pointed to a plant growing near the creek bank. Small leaves, purple flowers, roots that spread like fingers beneath the surface. That is what saves your son, or kills him. Depends on how well you listen. The plant looked harmless, almost delicate, but Naira's hands moved around it with the care of someone handling a loaded weapon. The roots are what matter, but only the outer layer of the root. Go too deep and you harvest poison instead of medicine. She demonstrated with a small knife, peeling away dirt with movements so precise they looked like ritual. Donovan knelt beside her, watching. The sun beat down on his neck and sweat dripped into his eyes, but he did not move. His son's life depended on memorizing every detail, every angle of the knife, every motion of her hands. The fever you call lung sickness happens when the body breathes smoke too long. The lungs become inflamed. They fill with fluid. The person drowns from the inside. Naira's voice stayed flat, clinical, as if she was not describing exactly how her daughter had died. Your doctors try to drain the fluid. Sometimes it works. Usually the patient dies anyway because they treat the symptom, not the cause. She cut the root free and held it up. Thin white fibers hung from the end like tiny threads. This root calms the inflammation, lets the lungs heal themselves. But the timing matters. Too early, and it does nothing. Too late, and the damage is permanent. Donovan watched her sort through the roots, selecting some and discarding others based on criteria he could not identify. How do you know which ones? Naira glanced at him with something that might have been contempt. By looking, by learning, by spending years understanding plants instead of assuming everything important can be bought or taken by force. The words stung, but Donovan said nothing. She was right. He had spent his life believing that money and muscle could solve any problem. That knowledge was something you hired people to have while you made the real decisions. Now his son was dying because of that arrogance. The next 3 days followed a pattern that ground Donovan down to nothing. Naira would find a plant and explain its purpose. Then she would make him find 10 more identical specimens without her help. Most of the time, he failed, brought back the wrong plant, or harvested it incorrectly. Each failure meant starting over, learning again, watching her demonstrate with patience that somehow felt crueler than anger. On the 4th day, his hands were cut from thorns and his back ached from kneeling, and his mind was stuffed so full of plant names and preparation methods that he dreamed about roots and leaves and timing. "You are learning too slowly," Naira said as they made camp that night. "Your son has maybe 10 days left. It will take you 2 days to ride home. That leaves 3 days to prepare and administer the medicine. If you make one mistake, he dies." Donovan's hands shook as he tried to start a fire. The flint kept slipping. His fingers would not obey. Finally, Naira took the flint from him and had flames going in 30 seconds. She did not mock him for it, which somehow made it worse. They ate dried meat in silence while the fire crackled. Donovan wanted to ask if she thought he could actually do this, if she believed his son had a chance. But he was afraid of the answer. "Why are you really helping me?" The question came out before he could stop it. Naira stared at the fire for a long time. "I am not helping you. I am helping a boy who did nothing wrong except be born to a coward." The word landed like a slap, but Donovan did not argue. "When your men burned our lodges, I had a choice. I could let hate consume me, let the need for revenge poison everything, or I could decide that one child's death was enough, that I would not let your son die just to balance scales that can never be balanced." She looked at him directly. "My daughter is gone. Nothing brings her back. Not your horses, not your suffering, not even your son's death. So I make a different choice. I teach you how to save him. And maybe, if you learn anything at all from this, you stop being the kind of man who burns villages and calls it protection." The fire popped. Somewhere in the darkness a coyote called. Donovan realized his face was wet, and he was not sure when he had started crying. "I am sorry," he said, and the words felt like trying to bail out the ocean with a cup. Insufficient. Pathetic. But all he had. Naira nodded once. "Tomorrow we harvest the final plants. Then I teach you preparation. You will practice 3 times. If you fail all 3, I go back to my husband and you go home to watch your son die. If you succeed even once, maybe he has a chance." She lay down by the fire and turned her back to him. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow decides everything." Dawn came cold and merciless. Naira had already harvested the final plants by the time Donovan woke, and they lay arranged on a flat stone like pieces of a puzzle he was supposed to solve. "First attempt," she said. "Show me everything." Donovan's hands trembled as he sorted through the roots. He had to select the right thickness, peel only the outer layer, remove exactly enough of the bitter core without going too deep. The knife felt clumsy in his grip. He worked slowly, checking each step against what she had taught him, second-guessing every motion. When he finished, Naira examined his work in silence that stretched until his chest hurt. Then she swept everything off the stone. Wrong. The core piece is too thick. It would make him vomit before the medicine could work. Try again. The second attempt went faster but no better. He peeled too much from one root and not enough from another. The proportions were incorrect. Naira said nothing, just reset the stone with fresh materials and stepped back. Donovan's heart hammered against his ribs. One chance left. His son's face floated in his mind. Fever bright and trusting. The boy believed his father could fix anything, had always believed that. And Donovan was about to prove him wrong one final time. He forced his breathing to slow, made himself remember each lesson not as separate facts, but as a single flowing process. The way Naira's hands moved, the angle of the knife, the smell of the roots when cut correctly versus incorrectly. He worked methodically, checking nothing, trusting muscle memory he was not sure he had built. When he finished, his hands were shaking so badly he had to clench them into fists. Naira studied the prepared medicine for what felt like an hour. She picked up each piece, smelled them, held them to the light. Finally, she wrapped everything in a cloth and handed it to him. That will work. Barely. If you follow the rest exactly. Relief hit Donovan so hard his knees buckled. He sat down hard on the ground and put his head in his hands. For a moment he could not breathe, could not think, could only feel the weight of the last 5 days and the knowledge that maybe, possibly, his son had a chance. Naira crouched beside him. Listen carefully because I will only say this once. The medicine needs to be given as tea. Boil water until it bubbles. Add the roots. Let it steep until the water turns golden. Not yellow, not brown. Golden. Like honey in sunlight. Give him 1 cup at dawn, 1 at midday, 1 at sunset. For 3 days. She paused, making sure he was listening. The first day he will seem worse. The fever will spike. He might become delirious. That is normal. The medicine is forcing his body to fight. Do not stop. Do not panic. Do not let your wife convince you to fetch a doctor who will only interfere. Donovan nodded, memorizing every word. The second day the fever breaks. He will sweat. Soak through his bedding. His breathing will become easier, but he will be weak. Give him the tea anyway. Keep him warm. She handed him a second bundle. These are backup roots, in case you spill the first batch or prepare it wrong in your panic. You will not get a third chance. They rode back toward the Apache camp in silence. Donovan kept the medicine bundles in his saddlebag, wrapped in cloth and leather to protect them like they were more valuable than gold. Because they were. When they reached the camp, Cahal was waiting. He looked at his wife first, checking for any sign of harm. Then his eyes moved to Donovan with an expression that promised violence if the answer was wrong. He learned, Naira said simply. Cahal nodded once. Then go. Your son has maybe 6 days left. You waste any more time and the knowledge means nothing. Donovan wanted to thank Naira, wanted to say something that acknowledged what she had given him when she owed him less than nothing. But words felt obscene in the face of what had passed between them. Instead, he nodded to her, then to Kahali, and turned his horse south. He rode hard, pushed the animal to the edge of endurance, and then a little further. Behind him, the Apache camp disappeared into dust and distance. Ahead of him, his son was either dying or waiting. Everything now depended on whether Donovan had actually learned what Naira tried to teach him, and whether mercy could flow from ground soaked in old blood. Donovan reached the ranch after 2 days of riding that left both him and his horse nearly broken. The sun was just rising when he stumbled through the front door, legs barely holding him upright. His wife met him in the hallway, eyes red from crying and no sleep. Where were you? Her voice cracked around the edges. The doctor came back yesterday. He said maybe 3 more days. Maybe less. Donovan did not waste time explaining. He went straight to his son's room and felt his heart drop into his stomach. The boy looked worse than when he had left. Skin gray as ash, breathing shallow and rapid like a trapped bird. The smell of sickness filled the room despite the open window. I have medicine, Donovan said. His wife stared at the cloth bundle in his hands. What medicine? From where? He met her eyes and saw the moment she understood. No, Donovan, no. You went to them? After what happened? Her voice rose with each word. You trusted those people with your life? They could have killed you. They still might have poisoned whatever that is. Donovan pushed past her to the wash basin. They had every reason to let our son die, or to kill me, but they did not, and this is his only chance. He started boiling water while his wife stood in the doorway, torn between fury and desperate hope. When the water bubbled, Donovan added the roots exactly as Naira had shown him. The smell that rose with the steam was bitter and earthy. He watched the color change from clear to pale yellow to the golden shade of honey in sunlight. His hands shook as he poured it into a cup. His son barely woke when Donovan lifted his head. Drink this, he said softly. All of it. The boy's throat worked weakly. Half the tea spilled down his chin, but enough went down. Donovan lowered his son's head back to the pillow and pulled the blanket up. His wife stood frozen by the door. What happens now? Donovan sat in the chair beside the bed. Now we wait. And at midday, I give him more. And at sunset, for 3 days, the hours crawled by like wounded animals. Marcus came to the door once, saw Donovan's expression, and left without speaking. Other men gathered in the yard, talking in low voices about the horses that were gone, and the ranch that was gutted, and the boss who had lost his mind. By midday, the boy's fever had climbed higher. His skin burned to the touch and he thrashed in his sleep, mumbling words that made no sense. Donovan's wife clutched his arm. "He is getting worse. We need the doctor. We need to stop this." Donovan gently removed her hand. "Naira said this would happen. The medicine forces the body to fight. It looks worse before it improves." He prepared the second cup of tea, hands steadier now, and managed to get most of it down his son's throat. The sunset dose went the same. Fever raging. The boy delirious and calling for people who were not there. Donovan did not sleep that night, just sat in the chair and watched his son's chest rise and fall, counting each breath like it might be the last. The second day began with the fever still burning. Donovan's wife had stopped arguing, but the doubt in her eyes cut deeper than any words. He prepared the dawn tea with movements that had become automatic, made sure the color was right, the temperature correct, got it into his son despite the boy fighting him weakly. Marcus appeared in the doorway around midday. "Some of the men are leaving, taking what pay you owe them and heading out. Figured you should know." Donovan nodded without looking away from his son. "Give them what they are owed, and thank them for staying as long as they did." That afternoon, something changed. The fever began to drop. Not dramatically, not like a miracle, but degree by degree the boy's skin cooled. His breathing became less frantic. When evening came and Donovan gave the third dose of the day, his son's eyes opened briefly and seemed to actually see him. "Dad?" The word was barely a whisper. Donovan's throat closed around the response. He just nodded and smoothed the boy's hair back from his forehead. His wife stood in the corner, hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. The boy fell back asleep, but it looked different now, less like dying and more like actual rest. Donovan allowed himself the smallest measure of hope, but Naira had said 3 days, and they were only through 2. The third day arrived with morning light that felt different, cleaner somehow. Donovan prepared the dawn tea and carried it to his son's room with his wife following close behind. The boy was awake, actually awake, not the fever dream half-consciousness of the past weeks. His eyes tracked movement, and when he spoke, his voice was weak but clear. "I am thirsty." Such simple words, but they hit Donovan like a thunderclap because they meant his son's mind was working again, meant he was aware enough to feel thirst. Donovan helped him drink the tea and then brought water. His son managed 3 sips before exhaustion pulled him back down, but he was smiling slightly when sleep took him. Marcus returned that afternoon while Donovan was preparing the midday dose. Most of the men left. 5 stayed. "We can probably keep the ranch going with that if we work twice as hard." He paused, studying Donovan's face. "The boy looks better." Donovan nodded, not trusting his voice. Marcus continued, "I was wrong about the horses, about calling you crazy. If my son was dying and someone told me they could save him for every horse in the territory, I would have done the same." He cleared his throat roughly. "We will rebuild. Take longer than it should, but we will manage." The midday dose went down easier. The boy stayed awake long enough to ask what had happened. Donovan told him a simplified version, that he had been very sick, that the medicine came from people who knew old healing methods. He did not mention the Apache, did not mention the 1,000 horses or the 7 days in the high country, or the woman whose daughter had died from the same fever. Those were weights Donovan would carry alone. By sunset, his son was sitting up slightly, propped on pillows, eating a few spoonfuls of broth. The fever was gone. The gray color had left his skin. He looked exhausted and thin, but alive in a way that Donovan had stopped believing was possible. His wife came to him that night after their son had fallen into genuine restful sleep. "I'm sorry I doubted you." Donovan shook his head. "You had every reason to doubt. I gave away everything we built. Trusted people I had wronged. By any reasonable measure, I gambled our entire future on something that should not have worked." She touched his face gently. "But it did work, and our son is alive. That makes you either the bravest man I know or the most foolish." "Maybe both." They stood together in the doorway, watching their son breathe easily for the first time in weeks. The ranch was gutted. Half the men were gone. Years of work had been traded away in a desperate bargain. But their son was sleeping peacefully, and that made every loss bearable. The next morning, Donovan gave his son the final dose. The boy drank it without assistance and asked for more food afterward. Color was returning to his face, strength to his voice. The medicine had worked. Against all probability and reason, Naira's knowledge had pulled his son back from death's edge. Donovan stood at the window, looking north toward Apache territory that he could not see but knew was there. He thought about Naira's daughter who had died from this same fever, about the choice she had made to save his son despite having every reason to let the boy die, about mercy that flowed from ground soaked in old blood. Marcus found him there. "What are you thinking about?" Donovan was quiet for a long moment. "About debts that can never be fully repaid, and about the kind of strength it takes to choose healing over revenge." Marcus nodded slowly. "Those Apache got their horses, that is payment enough by any measure." But Donovan knew it was not about the horses, had never been about the horses. The 1,000 horses were just proof that he understood what he was asking for, that he was willing to sacrifice everything for knowledge he had once dismissed as primitive. The real payment was the 7 days of humiliation, of learning, of being forced to see himself clearly and hate what he saw. That was what Naira had demanded, and what Kahali had enforced. Not gold or livestock, but transformation. 2 weeks later, Donovan's son was walking, slowly, with his mother's hand on his arm, but walking. The color had returned to his face and his appetite with it. The doctor who had pronounced him dying rode out to the ranch, examined the boy, and left shaking his head in confusion. "I have never seen anyone recover from that fever. Whatever you did, it should not have worked." But it had worked, and Donovan knew exactly why. He spent those 2 weeks thinking about the offer that had shocked an entire tribe, about how it sounded like an insult, but was really a father's desperate plea translated through ignorance and privilege, about how Kahali and Naira could have let him fail, could have taken his horses and given him false knowledge that would have killed his son. They had chosen differently. On the 15th day after his return, Donovan rode north again. Marcus tried to stop him. "You already paid them. Your business with the Apache is finished." Donovan shook his head. "No, it is not." He rode alone, carrying supplies on a pack horse. When he reached the Apache camp, warriors surrounded him immediately with rifles ready. He raised his hands, showing he was unarmed, and waited. Kahal appeared on horseback with Naira beside him. The leader's expression was unreadable. "You return. Why?" Donovan dismounted slowly. "To say thank you, and to ask how I can help your people the way you helped mine." Silence spread through the camp. Warriors exchanged glances. Cahal's eyes narrowed. "You think thanks erases what you did?" "No," Donovan said quietly. "Nothing erases it. But I learned something in those 7 days. I learned that my people take and call it progress. We destroy and call it civilization. We steal knowledge and call it science." He gestured to the pack horse. "I brought medical supplies, blankets, things your people might need. I will bring more when I can. And I will speak truth about what happened to your village. Not the story the marshal told, the real story." Naira dismounted and walked toward him. Her face was as hard as stone, but she stopped close enough to speak quietly. "Your son is well?" Donovan nodded. "Because of you. Because you chose mercy when I deserved none." She studied him for a long moment. "My daughter is still dead. Your gifts do not change that." "I know," Donovan said. "But maybe they change what happens next. Maybe they mean one less village burned, one less family destroyed, one less child dying because people like me decide that fear justifies everything." Kahal dismounted and stood beside his wife. He looked at Donovan with eyes that still carried judgment, but also something else. Something that might have been the beginning of respect. "The offer you made shocked my people because it sounded like you were buying my wife, like she was property. But Naira told me what the offer really meant. 7 days where you would be helpless, where you would have to learn from someone you once tried to destroy, where your pride would be ground to dust." He paused. "That took more courage than I expected from you." Donovan met his gaze. "It took desperation. But desperation showed me things I had refused to see. About what my people do, about what I did, about the difference between taking and asking, between conquering and learning." Kahal nodded slowly. "Keep your supplies. We do not need charity from you. But if you truly want to help, then change how your people see mine. Stop them from burning more villages, from taking more land, from deciding that anything they want is theirs by right." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to something fierce and final. "Your son lives because my wife chose mercy. Honor that mercy by becoming someone who deserves it." Donovan left the Apache camp as the sun set, riding back toward a ranch that was smaller now but felt different. His son was alive. His understanding of the world had been shattered and rebuilt. The offer that had shocked the tribe was never about one night. It was about 7 days of transformation, about a father learning that some knowledge cannot be taken, only given, about a woman who chose to heal the son of the man who helped kill her daughter. That was the real shock, not the 1,000 horses or the crude words of the offer, but the mercy that followed, and the question of whether Donovan would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of it. The story of what happened spread through the territories in whispers and speculation. Some said the rancher had gone mad, others said he had been tricked, but those who knew the truth understood something different. That sometimes the most shocking offer is not the one that insults, but the one that asks for forgiveness from people who have every right to refuse it, and that the real price of salvation is not what you pay, but who you become after. We have more stories from the untamed frontier waiting for you. Click the video on your screen now to see what happens when a debt is paid in ways no one expected. And if you want to hear more tales where honor, justice, and survival collide in the American wilderness, subscribe to our channel. These stories need to be told. Click that video now.